Hello, everyone from Florida, USA. Welcome to Humanly Possible channel, where we, excuse me, where if it's humanly possible, we may be talking about it. The purpose of this channel is to talk about the long-term effects of parental abduction and parental alienation and what that has, the effects that it has on children throughout their entire lives. I'm Dawn McCarty. I'm associate producer of Erasing Family, and I'm also an adult survivor of abandonment, parental abduction, and parental alienation. PA is our primary focus here on this channel, and as we talk to you and to others like us and share stories, and as well as talking to some experts that have been in this field and studying this field in depth, we hope that it'll inspire others to come forward and share their stories as well. So tonight we have a very special guest. We have Dr. Christine Giancarlo. She is an educator and an advocate for children, and she brings 3 decades of experience with parental alienation via her interaction with young adults and her own personal journey. She has authored a book called Parentectomy, and this book tells stories of 30 capable, loving parents who have become alienated from their children after divorce and separation. So based on the book is based on her peer review, which is called Kids Come Last. So this is an effective family law involvement in parental alienation, and that study was done in 2015. She is a senior anthropology lecturer and researcher at Mount Royal University in Canada, and her research sheds light on the urgent, widespread social crisis of parental alienation, which devastates children and families around the world. So I want to welcome Dr. Giancarlo to Humanly Possible. And before we talk to you, I want to real quick, Alyse, I'd like for you to introduce yourself so the guests also know who you are, and then we will jump right in.
Okay. Thank you, Dawn. And thank you, Dr. Giancarlo, for coming in today and speaking to us. We love the fact that you're an anthropologist and you're bringing in another perspective into parental alienation. That is just wonderful to hear. And I just like people to know that I'm a clinical psychotherapist. I am also an adult child of severe parental alienation like Dawn is. And so together we conduct these interviews trying to shine a little bit of a different light on PA. I also work with adult children of PA in my private practice. So I've got a kind of a frontline experience in that as well. But today I wanted to start off with welcoming you to the show. And if you could tell us a little bit about yourself, just so the viewers can get to know you, that would be amazing as well.
Sure, I'm glad to be here. Thanks for inviting me. I am an anthropologist. I am more specifically an applied anthropologist. So my training is in dealing with social problems and raising awareness, and then finding solutions. And I never thought that I would be involved in parental alienation, because until about 2004, I didn't even know there was such a thing. So I come from a background where my parents were together and actually loved each other, and I had a relatively happy childhood. So I naively thought that that was the case for most kids, and only to find out that is not the case. And as time went on, I was married for a long time, for almost 2 decades, to my first husband, and sadly that marriage ended. And my kids were able to go back and forth, a week with him and a week with me. And, we could attend parent-teacher interviews and special occasions together. And my kids are doing very well, long since adults. Then I got married again years after that. And my second husband was already experiencing difficulty accessing his 3 daughters. And I didn't know anything about that. And I really thought, maybe what we have to do is get a parenting order so there's a schedule and get this sorted out. And long story short, that didn't happen. And many, many years in the legal system, I found out too much about parental alienation. And that relationship ended when my second husband couldn't do it anymore, in his words. And so that story has a sad ending. And I guess now I have become a reluctant expert in this area because I feel that I need to be. I need to make this, make the change happen and help kids, you know, to know both their parents and to have an opportunity to have a real childhood. And so that's how I got involved. And I can't see this. I was hoping it would be an involvement that would be very short. But because we're a long way from real solutions, I see this as an ongoing project, as do now hundreds and hundreds of other specialists in mental health, academia, and also in the legal sphere.
Goodness. So I wanted to also talk a little bit about the fact that you've gone into a field that you didn't start out in and that you found yourself in is, yeah, so it's a very interesting sort of pathway, because I think you shared earlier before we went on air that it's like you're way, way into a career and now you found yourself sort of shooting off into the PA world. And I also wanted to congratulate you because the way you spoke about your first partner and after you'd separated and the way that you treated the children and you came in and you shared the time with the other person and you shared birthdays and events and all of those sort of things, and you managed to do that is a very great model. I'm sure your children they may not realize it, but that is like the way that things really ideally would need to be. I would like to see, but I know in some cases it's not possible, but well done for actually achieving it.
Thanks.
Exactly.
And yeah, I would hope that our case would be the norm, you know, and that hopefully the people that have not achieved that can have the supports they need to be moving towards that, because after all, you're married to your children for life and you chose to have them. And so you would think every parent would want to do their utmost to make sure their children become loving, productive citizens in adulthood.
Right. Right. I wanted to ask you, you were involved in the Erasing Family film, which has recently been released. And I'm kind of curious as to how you got involved being in Canada and the films. Ginger started out in Argentina, then she came back to the States. So it ended up being a global, this one became a global film really. So can you talk to us a little bit about how you got involved with the film?
Sure, I'm really excited about that film. I think Ginger did an amazing job and a lot of us were working on it in different ways. So what happened in my case, in order to become associated with the film, I had done the Kids Come Last study, but I also am a lecturer and I teach a lot. So every year I have about anywhere from 250 to 400 students, and they are all young adults. And so over many, many years, going on 30 years, I heard stories that were, you know, consistent about how kids didn't have access to a parent, you know, how they had various problems, learning problems, attention problems, behavioral problems, and they never could understand why they had these problems, and they thought there was something wrong with them, and so on. And this was long before I knew about parental alienation. Then I started to ask questions in my class when I was going through it with my second husband. And I said, you know, do you have any of you want to volunteer any information about your backgrounds and how you get along with your parents, whether divorced or not, and what kind of influences they've been in your lives? And it started to become clear that a lot of the problems that my young adult students were having were, of course, not about them. It was about them not having an adequate childhood. Sometimes no childhood at all, really. You know, they were grown-ups in little kids' clothing, and adultified, which is the term we use now, you know, when kids should not be. Kids need to be kids in order for them to have appropriate, you know, brain development. So when I was finished that study, I was thinking, what do I do now? Because that study involved interviews, right? So I had interviewed a lot of alienated parents, one grandparent, and the stories were so horrific. And my own story with my husband was, in my opinion, very horrific as well. And I thought, I feel like I'm doing a disservice to my interviewees if I just leave it alone now. I think I need to tell these stories. So I contacted all of them again and I said, what do you think about me writing a book? And I'll change your name. I won't use last names. And, you know, the vast majority of them said, please use my name. So I did not use last names. I only used their first names, but those are the real stories taken from the interviews and that I did for the Kids Come Last study. So my book was published a few years later. So once that came out, then I was thinking, how now do we make this about the kids instead of just about the parents? Because I know there's an incredible fallout, and all of us are living the reality that our society is not as healthy as it could be if alienation did not occur, right? So if we could eradicate alienation, we'd be taking a giant leaps forward in terms of a mentally healthy society worldwide. And so I thought, you know what, I'm going to raise some money on a GoFundMe site. Didn't know anything about GoFundMe. And I thought, what the heck, I'm going to put out a plan. I want to make a film about this problem in Canada and raise some money. I was amazed, you know. And then I, of course, was thinking, how am I going to do this? Because I know nothing about making films. And at that time, Ginger and I somehow found each other. So I think on GoFundMe, she found me or I found her, I can't remember, because she was also trying to raise money for a racing family. Yes. So once we connected in cyberspace, you know, then we decided, let's just collaborate. We put all the money together and worked on further fundraising and so on. And of course, she has the expertise, and so it took off. And so that was a huge relief to me because I had somebody who really was knowledgeable. And she herself, as you know, is an adult child of alienation. And so, you know, she was best able, I think, to talk to young adults because they could relate to her. As you both know, you're most likely going to talk to somebody who understands where you're coming from. And because the general public still doesn't really even know what parental alienation is, that can be a real struggle. So then, you know, it was great. Then the movie just kind of took off over time. And Ginger came to my school and interviewed some of my students, amongst others, because she wanted to try to make it as global as she could within a very limited budget and time to get this out.
Yeah. Well, I think it's interesting too, because Canada has a totally different setup when it comes to screening the film. Can you talk a little bit about how that works? Or,
you know, like in terms of how it's released now?
Yeah, because in the States, we set up individual screenings, you know, wherever we could, where I think in Canada, it's all done through a specific organization. Is that right?
Yeah, it's at this point it is. It's through CAFE. It's called a Canadian Association for Equality, is sort of the big umbrella name. And that's because they also had to manage our fundraising because we had to get the money from Canada to the States where Ginger was making the film.
Gotcha.
And so I couldn't do that. And we tried all kinds of different ways to do it. But we also had quite a bit of support, financial, but also in time and expertise from more local chapters of CAFE and in a group called CCMF, the Canadian Council for Men and Families.
Yeah.
And they were, of course, those were fathers who in many cases were alienated and looking for supports. But we also had organizations of moms who were interested in getting involved too. And so this was a way that we could manage screenings using this one vehicle, really, in order to get it through Canada as fast as possible. And so I held a few screenings and others, of course, across Canada, but we've really only begun. You know, we need to do a whole lot more of those. And as usual, it's difficult to get the advertising out there, the funding to just even hold a screening and such. But it's such an important film.
Well, and I think we need more of these films. We need, because I think that we change hearts through film, where, you know, when people go to see a film, they can relate more to it as they're watching it. They get that creative brain going. They're kind of a captive audience where they're, you know, some people actually role play in a film as they're watching it. And I think it is an excellent tool for helping to change the hearts or even soften hearts. Like when you're watching the film, maybe, you know, things sink in a little bit for some individuals. So I think more films. I would vote for more films.
And so many young people really don't even know they're alienated, just like the targeted parents who think they are alone, and they maybe think that they did something wrong. You know, maybe my child shouldn't see me, even though I was a very involved mom or dad when we were married. Maybe there is something wrong with me, you know, because you start to internalize that kind of rejection. And that's what I saw with my husband, you know, the alienated dad, because he was an excellent dad and, you know, a great influence on his kids, and all three of his daughters loved him very much, but it was so difficult to see him. And at one time, his oldest daughter said, you know, please don't try to contact us anymore because it makes our lives too difficult with mom. You know, so I think kids often just give up, and then time goes on and they sort of just, in a way, forget about that parent, but at the same time, they never feel good. You know, so they always are dealing with feelings of sadness. They're dealing with, you know, low self-esteem. They feel, you know, maybe I'm not a very good friend. You know, like you two know much better than I do because I was not, fortunately, an alienated child. But I can't imagine dealing with that. And then to find out one day that, wait, there are other people that went through this in childhood too. You just right away, you're validated as a person. And a lot of your feelings probably, I would expect, you know, all of a sudden come to the surface again, right? And then it's sort of, what do I do with all these feelings? Because I'm so overwhelmed now by what happened to me.
Yep. Alyse and I talk a lot about that, about how it's not that we forgot, it's that we can't talk about it. We can't bring it up. We can't, you know, it's better just to not think about it sometimes. It's safer.
Yeah, because it's a slippery slope. And the statement that you said before with the girls who said that it was just easier for them to not see dad because of mum, that is can be the other way around, depending on who the alienator is. But for us, if we came back from a contact visit or ever spoke about how much we missed dad or anything, there would be very serious consequences from the alienator. And they'd come in all different forms. And for us, it was just safer to not mention it, not talk about grief, not talk about missing them, not ask questions about when you're going to see them again. That's the world that we lived in. So, and often a lot of targeted parents don't realize what's going on in the house of the alienator and why the kids are pulling back. It's not often about how much we love the targeted parent or how much we miss them. It's safer for us not to do that and to maintain the peace and that calm in the house, because if we upset the alienator, we cop it. It's not them copying it, it's us. So they do it, we're the front line who are really copying the brunt of it, and then they're secondary out to the targeted parent. It's often not the targeted parent who cops it first, it's us.
Right.
So yeah, so there's a little bit of a different dynamic going on there, and people think it's just often the targeted parent, but for those kids who are in severe PA, we get it first all the time. It doesn't stop. And so we need to keep that parent regulated, so we learn very quickly how to do that. So that's, and this is the message to the targeted parent. It's not about you or how we feel about you a lot of the time. It's what we're being exposed to at the house.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, no doubt. You know, in my family of origin too, I have 4 brothers, and one of them is, he has 3 kids, and he is completely severed from his son, his youngest child, because of alienation. The other 2 girls who were older still have a relationship with him, and in fact, that relationship has become stronger with time, as they've become adults. But I was just talking to one of my nieces, and she said, you know, that her brother still does not want to see or talk to his dad, my brother, because he's still worried about the fallout with his mother, because he knows that she will completely, in my niece's words, flip out. And he's now 24. You know, so my nephew still at the age of 24 is afraid to create that kind of fallout with his mother. Even he doesn't even live with her. That's how deep this goes. And even though I know what I know, now I'm always amazed by stories like yours, because I'm amazed at how deep this goes, and how long that person has their, you know, kind of like tentacles in the lives of their kids because of enmeshment.
Yeah, and it's in my practice, I see people who are in their 50s and 60s who are still talking and coming from that fear space about, well, I can't speak about that. What if they find out I've spoken about it? What if
like
I do something and then they're going to dysregulate, or not use those words, but I'm going to see this behavior. So it's just safer for me to agree, do what needs to happen, stay in the enmeshment. And it's not until I start doing the enmeshment work and teaching them about what's happening, because they come into me, they don't even realize they're in PA a lot of the time. They have no sense of self. They have huge abandonment stuff. They don't know why. It's always divorce or separation, and they're very, very stuck in this relationship. And it's not until they realize the patterning and what happens if they have a voice, and then the alienator starts to dysregulate, then they learn to have more of a voice and cope with that. And they're quite old, some of the people that I'm speaking to, but that's the power of the enmeshment. And I've had one young woman come in, she's 28, just in the last month, and through the enmeshment, talking and everything that we discuss around PA, she's now actually having a voice and saying no to her mother. So that's when my work is, the healing, that space. How do we move out of that space safely and become detached and learn how to stand up as adults on our own? Whereas we are not, that's not something that's given to us, and that's a human right for us. That's not given to us.
Yeah, and then when you realize that everything that you were told, and when you're at this age as well, that everything that you lived through and all your entire life now has to be completely reanalyzed, because now you have to determine what was true and what wasn't true. And so now we have to do, and we continue to have to do that. So it keeps going. It doesn't stop just because, oh, we were a victim of this. You know, we have to continuously analyze everything our alienator talks about, and anything that they say, we're skeptical, you know, because the trust has been violated in one of the worst ways possible for a child. You know, when that bond and that trust, that enmeshment, you know, when you figure out what's happening and you stand up and we start standing on our own 2 feet and we start working through this process, it's a lot of work. It really is, because we have to come up for air somewhere.
Yeah.
And, you know, sometimes it's easier to just go back to what was familiar and not do the work. And that can be really, really hard for some of us coming out of that to actually make it all the way through.
And when you've rejected a parent, for whether you did it intentionally or not, you know, when a parent has been rejected for a long time, for that child, I think too, how can you help but feel that, you know, you did the wrong thing? I feel terrible now because I harmed my my parent who turned out to be a targeted parent. And to try to understand that it had nothing to do with you. And you were just in survival mode for a long time.
But that
So
guilt is hard too. That is hard to swallow.
Yeah, and I know when Ginger came to my school and was filming, I was there that day. And so after she did one of the interviews, my student came out of they had a sort of a one-on-one room with the camera. And so my student came out and she was really upset and crying. And so I felt terrible for her, but she had volunteered. She wanted to tell her story. And I said, "Are you okay?" And she said, "I understand now what happened to me, but I just don't know if I can hate my mom."
Mm-hmm.
And so I thought that was a real important moment for me to realize it's very, very important that kids realize that the choosing is over. You know, for their whole growing up lives, they had to choose one parent over the other. And now they're just feeling that they found out what's happened and now they're going to have to flip allegiance. And so to realize that, no, nobody wants you to hate your alienating parent. That parent needs support and help. And now you can love both your parents and maybe work towards, you know, being part of that reunification of the entire family unit.
Yeah, part of that is finding a way that you, as an adult, help our alienating parent understand that that no longer works. So we're going to start here, and we're going to keep working on our relationship. You know, that's a struggle too. That's something that we continually have to work with as well. We have constantly having to work with that person.
Yeah, because that person, like in our case, the alienator is still stuck back in that time as well as when the divorce happened and everything that happened to her at that point. And she's very stuck there. And from that moment on, every single event, every single baby, every single wedding, every single christening, every single everything reminds her about that. And if, like my dad, we reunited after 25 years, so he'll come to some events now, but he missed out on all our earlier ones. But even that re-triggers her and re-triggers him because of the trauma that he was put through as well. So I've got, usually at a recent family event, I'll have two adults in complete trauma, like at an event, who are not coping, both dysregulating at the same time, and we're trying to, you know, hold the peace, keep everyone at bay. It's just never stops. Never, ever, ever does it stop. It always creeps in on some level at some time, and it is boring, to tell you the truth, when you get older. When we're younger, we just are freaking out about it, but when we're older, we're just like over it, and I'm kind of very bored with their whole arguing and breakdown of their relationship, because it's overshadowed our whole lives.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
exactly. Yeah. And you know, for the alienator, that person may never come to understand what happened or why he or she did it, right? Because chances are, even though we used to not talk about it much because it was sort of like a taboo subject, right? The mental illness piece. But as you know, personality disorders are very common. Some would say, you know, Craig Childress down there in the US, he would say probably in most cases, if not all, there is a personality disorder in the alienator. So that person is unable to put their children's needs first, right? So the child, and as you're saying, Alyse, you know, your whole life you're trying to sort of smooth the waters, but there is no smoothing when one parent's dealing with his or her own post-generational trauma, right? That they've carried down the line, and the other parent who was targeted, they have an amazing resiliency, you know, because the ones that cope learned healthy coping patterns because they had to. Some of them don't cope, right? We know there's sad outcomes in those cases, but the targeted parents who survive are somehow, I can't imagine losing my kids, but those targeted parents are somehow able to move on, and they keep loving those kids who reject them. And they will be okay. You know, they'll understand when you say, you know, I'm getting married. I want both of you to be there because you're both my parents, but you know how dad is, or you know how mom is, whoever is the alienator. But you know, the targeted parent will be okay. The targeted parent will do the right thing, even if it means they have to sit at the back of the room. They're not going to get to sit at the head table. They're not going to get to make a speech. I have never seen an exception to that rule. I'm amazed by that, because these targeted parents say, I just want to be part of my adult child's life. And I don't care at all if that means I have to take a back seat so that my child can have
That
what
unconditional
maybe
love.
is normal life.
Mhm.
Yeah, so I think that's probably the best bet, is to, you know, try to talk to the targeted parent about how do we manage this situation. Because I also never met a targeted parent who was out to get the alienator. And that really surprised me.
Right.
I thought the targeted parents, when I interviewed them, they would talk about how much they hated their ex, and I thought
Totally
most of
different
them probably,
conversations.
yeah, and I thought most of them probably left the alienator, you know, at the end of the marriage or the relationship. And in fact, that wasn't the case. So many of these alienated parents were not the ones who decided to end the relationship. And secondly, they talked about the alienator as needing help. And, you know, she doesn't have the support she needs. Or, you know, he thinks that everything is about status and he has to prove himself all the time. And I wish that wasn't the case. You know, so they're as supportive as they can be within a really awful dynamic.
Yeah.
Mm.
One of
Yeah.
the things I've noticed,
Sorry, Dawn, go ahead.
sorry. One of the things I've noticed as an adult, and actually it's taken me a while to learn this. So the more I learn about what happened to me, the more I learn about what happened to my mom. And not to excuse her or make it, you know, try to placate or justify it. But I'm standing there and I'm looking back now, and I can see that, you know, where she came from and what happened to her as a child. And the more we talk about these things, the more the pieces start coming together. So Alyse, for example, the other day was just talking about, you know, how parents may have been alienated themselves. And I started thinking about it. And I really started thinking, wow, you know, my mom used to live with her grandmother. She was so close to her grandmother. And then one day her mom just took her away from her grandmother and she wasn't allowed to go there anymore. And she never met her real father because he left the picture before she was born. And then when her grandmother and her grandfather died, who she was very, very close to, nobody in the family bothered telling her because they just alienated her from the rest of the family. And even when her own mother died, they didn't even bother telling her. She had to wait for a couple of weeks for someone to finally get around to telling her. So she was alienated from her own family as a whole, not just from a parent. So her family alienated her. And I think that helps to maybe shed light on what happens. And when I deal with my mom now, because you asked me a year ago, it was like, Mom, just back off. I don't want to talk about it. Now it's like, okay, because Ginger came, I was talking to Ginger in the beginning and I shared my story and she asked me if my mom would be willing to be filmed. And I was like, oh no, there was no way she was in that. One, she didn't even know that I'm even doing this. So to spring that on her would probably have made it end in a probably not so good, not a very good way. But now that this year has gone by and I understand it a little bit better, I might be able to talk to her about it. I don't know if I would, but I might be able to face that if I needed to someday, because I have a different understanding myself.
Wow, that's huge growth in a year.
Yeah, I've only found out about this. I reunited with my dad in 2016, and this is when we started putting things together. And then he died in 2018.
Oh,
And
wow.
I was furious all over again. And I just started looking online and started talking about it. And then it just kind of blew up from there. And here I am. I got involved with the film. I got involved with the National Parents Organization of Florida. Started connecting, talking to people around the world, talking to other children, talking to other parents. And then I met Alyse. She's doing the exact same thing. She's got her, communities and stuff that she works with, and she's talking to some of the same people that I've been talking to, and then some, different people. So we bring a lot of people in, and there's a pretty huge community of people that we've been able to reach out to and touch and help.
Yeah, I think unfortunately, because of all the time that's gone by and all the, like you said before, academic infighting and stuff, but who's right, who's wrong, nitpicking the arguments, and sometimes going way off the rails in terms of what are you actually arguing for?
Yeah.
And that's, I think, a lot to do with the family law influence too, right? It sort of is an adversarial system that rewards people who are alienators and so on. But as you said, somewhere along the line, we forgot about the kids.
Yes.
And when you think about just the children, I don't understand why there's an argument at all.
Yeah.
Like I spoke at the teachers conference this year here in where I live in Alberta, and the teachers are nodding because they get it. They already know. They see their students at every age.
They do.
And they know that a lot of their problems are because they are not able to access a parent. And the problem could just be a very quiet child who appears to be sad. Never causes any trouble, maybe academically does okay. But you can just tell, right? There's no childhood joy there. And the teachers know that, but they don't know what to do about it. And they would be the first ones to say, why are people talking about domestic violence? That's a huge issue, but that's a different issue. We're not talking about parents who have a history of abuse. We're talking about kids with loving relationships with both parents, and then a parent is taken away. And how can anybody argue that that's a bad idea? It just amazes me that I almost feel like the argument has been so fragmented, and the argument being kids have a right to both parents. It's such a no-brainer that instead it's become so fragmented that nobody really knows who's talking about what anymore.
Yes.
And they start nitpicking about definitions and so on. And yet the people who are working hands-on with kids know exactly what we're talking about. Whether they know what it's called or not doesn't matter.
Well, some of the things you were talking about, sorry, you go this time.
Oh, sorry, I just wanted to mention that one of the adult children that we interviewed is also she is an assistant principal in a special needs school, and a lot of the kids in the school have PA. It's just PA everywhere, and because she's an adult child, she knows all about PA. She's a front line in the classrooms with these kids, and being an adult survivor herself, she knows exactly how to speak to them. This is where we need to be putting money. We need to be putting money into the education of the professionals who are working on the front line. And in my world, there is absolutely not enough mental health professionals who know about PA. There just isn't. These conversations I can't have with a lot of my colleagues because they aren't aware of the breadth and the depth of the PA stuff. But the first thing that I do when people come into me is I do a genogram, and I look at the history of the family and the emotional cutoffs and everything, so I can start piecing it all together. And a lot of the people who come into me, there's big histories of abandonment and adoption and war and PTSD and that dad not being there and mum being moved out of the family, and just huge gaps. And then we've got PA presenting itself, and it's like, well, it's been the perfect storm, like generationally for ages. And that's what I wanted to speak to you about too, because as an anthropologist, and I've listened to some of your talks, and one of the ones that I was really interested in is if you could explain a potential explanation for the root cause of PA from an anthropologist's perspective, which is something that a lot of people may not have heard or been, just may not have heard.
Well, one of the one of the premises is rise of the state, you know, and we can go way back to the advent of agriculture 10, 12,000 years ago, and really where that goes. So I can give you a real quick sort of close summary of that. But I think today too, it's interesting that I have gotten criticized by both men and women in different forums. The women will criticize me in saying I'm selling out feminism. And I'm thinking, how am I selling out feminism? Because is it not the best case scenario if you're divorced that your kids go half time with your partner, your ex-partner, and half time with you? That way you have a life. When you have your children, you can be the best parent you can be. And the ex-parent, the ex-partner is also doing their share, which was sadly lacking in very patriarchal times where mom was, you know, 105% responsible for the outcome of the children, you know. So there's that in a way, and that is still perpetuated. Mm-hmm. And then, you know, you also have the criticisms coming from men saying that they don't believe that women can be alienated, right? So they're saying, no, this is a father's rights issue. And my stand on that is I'll say it's nobody's rights except the children's.
The child's right.
Yeah. It's a child human rights.
Exactly. So I think, you know, when I wrote that first article for NPO, like for National Parents, then I was talking about the evolutionary aspect because we have such a long history of patriarchy. And when you use that word patriarchy, right away, I think, you know, men's eyes glaze over because they think, oh, here we go, it's male bashing time, right? So I think just showing that the patriarchy is simply, you know, it's a hierarchy, right, of power and privilege. And if there was a single woman at the top bossing everybody around, that's a matriarchy. That would be bad too. But you've got descending levels of power and privilege. And that's just an unstable system where the vast majority of people are somewhere near the bottom and they're very disempowered. So if there's a way for them to gain any kind of power, they're going to try to do that, right? They're going to try to change the system. And so when you come from a long background of that, then, you know, men owned children. You know, we still have, our surnames are either our husbands or our fathers. You know, those kinds of long-term habits that are so entrenched, we think of them as the norm. Then you've got a legal system that is arguing these cases, and they're now afraid to give the dad any kind of access to the child if the mom says no, right? That's pretty much all she has to do is say no. And then right away, the judge and the lawyers are going, oh no, like, you know, mom's alleging abuse, or mom's saying he's a horrible person, or he's a big drinker, or whatever, right? So they want to side with the party who has in the past been very disempowered, because there's less of a price to pay ultimately, I think, in the judicial system. On the other hand, when moms are alienated, they have a very tough time proving that in a court of law, because the courts know that they have that bias. So they'll say, you know, well, they may not say it, but they'll think it. You know, we're already favoring mom here. So I don't think that you're actually alienated, because you actually have the best chance of getting custody. So if there are, you know, allegations of parental alienation, we're not even gonna, you know, we don't even care about that. We're just gonna say you are definitely mentally ill. You have some kind of unfitness, and therefore we're gonna side with dad, because, you know, so there's kind of a double whammy there, right? Like they're so stuck in a blinkered and outdated worldview that they can't see that each case should be looked at on its own. And really, you know, let's face it, in the vast majority of cases, they shouldn't be going to court in the first place.
Yeah.
You know,
well,
so
like
that's the other, you know, that you go to court for intervention as a last ditch effort, right? Nobody wants to throw money down the drain, which is what you're doing when you hire a lawyer. Yeah. But the prevention piece is completely missing.
Yes. And the other thing is that some of the alienators that I work with, they have such terrible trauma themselves as well from and it can be historical trauma as well. And sometimes when I do work with them, they can actually start to see how their behaviours have been brought into them, because we know that alienators are often taught alienation from previous generations too. And because especially for kids who grow up in that, that's what we're taught as well. So we have to really look at that part and say, well, and understand it, like this huge picture. We need to bring in this huge picture of, my goodness, that's what was going on. This is what I've been subjected to. I'm practicing some of that myself. I need to get an understanding around that. And a lot of people are saying, alienators, we can't work with them, we can't do this, we can't do that, but we can. I'm finding that we can, especially if it's centered around abandonment. A lot of the time, if I'm doing work with them around that, they can actually gain insight into that as well, and develop some emotional intelligence around that and some insight, and do some intrinsic work. And that involves a lot of psychotherapy. And I think they're not usually wanting to come into psychotherapy until they're kind of forced into it, or the children haven't spoken to them for years and they don't understand why, and they end up with me. So it's a bit of a Russian roulette as to who's coming in and why, and it's very, very interesting. But I feel sorry for them too, even though I had a pretty full-on alienator in my life. Part of me and my heart that feels great compassion for them as well, because a lot of them would have been alienated children themselves, or have had some big event happen where they didn't feel that they mattered or were loved or seen. So it's created the mental health stuff.
Absolutely.
So it's a very interesting dichotomy.
Mm-hmm.
And they're crying for help.
Yeah.
You know, so the worst thing anyone could do is say you are now punished as a result of your behavior, because they feel they've been punished their whole lives.
Yeah.
Whether they have or not depends on the source of the trauma and so
Absolutely.
on. But even if it's the perpetuation of alienation over generations itself, you know, that's its own trauma. So these people also need supports, so that if they are unable to be appropriate parents, what do they need in order to become so? And if they actually felt that they could ask for help, and that somebody's there who really gets it and does care about them too, that's what they're crying for, right? Is attention.
Yeah, instead of using us to regulate, they use us to regulate.
Yeah.
That's the bottom line, and we've got to ask why.
It seemed to be like the alienators are, in a way, sort of, you know, infantile in some ways. They're narcissists because that's what 2-year-olds are. So I don't want to insult adults and say that they're 2-year-olds, but emotionally they're very stuck, and so they have to have a way that is positive to move forward with that. Otherwise, they have to hang on to, you know, you and Dawn, right? They have to hang on to their children forever, because the worst thing possible in their minds would be for their children to become independent. They've already been abandoned in their own minds, and now if their children are going to abandon them too. I see that all the time, and you two probably do as well, where, you know, the alienators are either consciously aware of that or very unconsciously, but it's so blatant that they just are terrified their kids are going to move out and actually be successful on their own.
Yeah.
Yes. Yep. Yeah. It's huge. I had a gentleman come in this week whose marriage is in big trouble, but he's also showing signs of being an alienator. His wife is leaving, and he said, when we were talking in the room, he said, I do all of those behaviors. He said, I had no idea that I was actually doing those behaviors. He said, oh my gosh, I need to do work around that so that I'm not doing that and putting that on my children. And I'm like,
fascinating. That's fascinating that someone would actually
pre-divorce.
Yeah.
Well, we think, you know, there's those 3 levels, right, which really have stood the test of time, the mild, moderate, and severe alienation, and the alienating behaviors that go with those. And, you know, the more research that comes out, the more we are understanding that in mild cases, parents may be doing those things, you know, and they actually do love their kids, but they maybe hate their ex so much. They can't look beyond that. And when they're told that this is having a really detrimental effect on their children, they're horrified. And they'll often take a step back and reevaluate how they're dealing with the situation. So, you know, I have a hard time thinking that everybody has a personality disorder who's an alienator. Because, you know, you see little bits of those behaviors occur in many divorces, you know, even where the kids do go back and forth. Parents may badmouth each other, but if they're told this is a bad idea and it's harmful on your kids, most of them will stop doing it.
Yeah, well, it's the norm. I find it to be the norm. Most people, if you go and talk to them about, you can see it in families at barbecues. You can see it, the denigration of other people, the alliances of one family against the person who's being targeted, the conversations in front of the children. It's been the norm for as long as I've been born. I've been listening to all the different factions in my family speak terribly about my dad in front of me, openly.
Wow.
For years and years, for my whole life, I've been listening to those conversations. And now we step in and we say, hang on a second, but I'm not in the enmeshment now. Hang on a second, stop doing that. You don't understand what you're doing. And that creates another wave of discontent amongst them, because it's like, well, they've had this dialogue, this cyclical maladaptive pattern going for years and years and years, and they're all grooving down the same neural pathways with the same old boring story. And where I'm now standing up saying, no, stop it, cut it out. There's actually this side of it, and we cannot be doing this, because then the next generation of children have all heard the story now. So our children and our grandchildren have now heard the story, and now we're seeing the alienation against my father appearing in children who don't even know him.
Right. Yeah.
And that is not okay.
And you know how the longer the stories get told, the more they become real.
Yeah,
so
absolutely.
The narrative strengthens over time, for sure. So good for you to shut that down. But I feel like, too, that the general public, that's why they really, you know, all of us need to know about it, whether we've experienced it or not. Because probably all of us at some point in time hear somebody bad-mouthing their ex.
Exactly.
You know, that could be anywhere. Like, I remember that even before I knew about parental alienation. You know, when my kids were in daycare, I'd hear things like that. And of course, the kids would often be hearing that as well. But I think if all of us stopped being sympathizers when we heard those comments, that would go a long way.
Yeah.
So now, like last term, I had a student who said to me, you know, she has a 4-year-old, and she said, oh, I'm so stressed out because I'm a single mom, and, you know, dad's not in the picture. And rather than say, oh, poor you, your life must be really tough, I just said, that's a real shame for your child. I hope there are ways that you can both figure out how to make him a part of your son's life, because that will be helpful to him and to you. And then she didn't say anything. But I thought, you know, if we could all do that so that there is not the sympathetic ear, which again just builds the alienation even more.
Yeah.
Thank you for doing that on behalf of all of the AKODS. Thank you for doing that.
Well, good to know that that's how you feel, because, you know, I'm always wondering too, is that the right thing? But I just feel like I'm so much more sensitive to that now, and it's everywhere. You know, people like to use that, and single dads do the same thing, you know, like, oh, poor me, and I have so much on my plate. Well, no, don't you do? That's why you still have the other parent.
Well, you make them stop and think, and maybe if they stop and think that, you know, when you bring it up like that, you're completely you're a third party, you're not involved, there's no stake in the outcome or whatever is involved with that particular family. So maybe there's some credibility there where they don't want to listen to what any of their close friends have to say, or their family members, or the other parent for that matter. So maybe coming from, you know, an outside source is a good way to approach this. And the more people that we talk to and the more people that understand what it is, know the definition of it and can spot it and can speak to it, I think would definitely go a long way.
And it's about not aligning with the person who's doing that too, because I do notice they're collecting alliances to validate their story. And by listening and being a sympathetic listener and sympathizing with it instead of staying and
empowers
by
that.
Speaking on, I think it's often what I'll do is I will advocate for the child, and I will say, well, what does the child want? What would the child want if you were the child? Do you think that that's a good idea or not? What do you think would be a better idea? It's like,
yeah,
getting them to step into that empathic space of the child instead of collecting the alliances and making them right. And then we've got the competition and not connection or empathy happening here.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I don't know about where you in your countries, but in Canada too, there is a very strong, best interest of the child premise that is constantly being used and talked about as if that's the only thing that matters. But best interest of the child, what does that mean? So we talked about that already, right? It means both parents. But if you ask a child who's already severely alienated and you say, how do you feel? The child's going to say, I hate my mom, or I hate my dad. I don't want to see that. And too often the courts will say, okay, well then you don't have to see that.
Well, that's what
Instead
we
of
were
that being
speaking
such
about.
a big thing. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that's what she was talking about, that we will say that because we still have to go home with that person.
Yeah.
So it doesn't matter. You can ask us that all day long and we're going to tell you what they want us to say.
That's right. We're not going to tell you the truth, because telling the truth, once we get home, it could go very badly for us. So we're going to tell you what we think you want to hear. It's not going to be what's in our hearts. It's not going to be that, because for me, it would have been, I want to see my dad. I want to be allowed to see my dad, but it wasn't safe to say that. Oh my God. It was, Dad's a monster. Dad's going to do this. Dad's going to do that. Oh, yeah. We're going with that story. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
So for the court to ask a child in that position is ridiculous.
Yeah. There has to be a way to do that without doing that, without asking the child, because one, it's pointless to ask the child because they're not going to tell you the truth. And if they did, they're going to get in trouble for it. So there has to be a way. And I think if you look at, if I were a judge and I saw two parents enter the room and one is saying horrible things about the other one saying, I just want to spend time with my child, there should be some red flags if one parent is going off the rails and the other one is just saying, I just want to spend time with my child. That's a massive flag for me. And to try and exclude the parent as often as it happens, it really needs to sink in that common sense should tell you that this is happening far too often and there's really no basis for it. So therefore, why would we honor their request and say, no, you get equal share parenting? And that's the bottom line. And
the prevention piece is really what has to happen. Intervention should be the last ditch effort, and it's already a last ditch effort, but unfortunately it's used all the time because it's almost always last ditch. But if you had the default 50-50 parenting time and parents knew that, we don't care what their relationship was like, right? Their relationship is over, but not with their children. So if they knew that was the case, that they're still going to have to work with this person. If they can't speak civilly to each other, okay, then they do parallel parenting. There are ways you can do those transitions between houses and so on. And we know that the conflict piece that's been used and overused as an argument to avoid having equal default share, 50-50 parenting, has no traction, right? Because it's worse for a child to lose a parent than for them to be seeing their parents in conflict. And then there's really good data on that now. So that used to be the old argument, right? Like, well, the parents hate each other, so therefore let's choose one parent.
Well, and that rebuttable presumption of that needs to be there as well.
Yeah.
So that, the judge needs to have a basis that I need to know that this is going to be an equal thing unless there's evidence to prove otherwise.
Yeah, allegations don't count. If you make allegations, they better come with verified documentation.
Exactly.
Yes.
Otherwise, I don't want to hear it. Right? So
Yes.
if this person has no history of domestic violence, there goes the second argument, and the only other argument that some people are still trying to use as the reason why they shouldn't have 50-50 parenting.
Yes.
And
yes.
the incentive is still there too. The cash incentive in Canada, it's huge. There are big rewards for alienating.
Yeah.
So you're actually benefiting by refusing the other parent access.
Yeah.
And that, in my mind, that's just sick. I don't know where that idea came from, but
Probably the US.
you don't pay child support, you go to jail. However, if you refuse access to your child, nothing happens.
Nothing happens.
That's terrible. That's what happened to my dad. He was put in jail for that. And I tell you what, he is still scarred for life about that.
No doubt.
And
Imagine.
oh my God, I don't think that was a fit punishment whatsoever at all. There's definitely other ways to deal with these things. And if the alien, what needs to happen, I believe, is 50-50, but at the same time, the risk for us going back the 50% to the alienator and copying it for the time we're away, that needs to be addressed.
Yeah.
Both people need to be in therapy, really good trauma-informed psychotherapy, not just 6 sessions of counselling under some plan with some base level psychologist who doesn't understand the intricacies of PA. Needs to be trauma-informed, long-term psychotherapy, and they need to understand what not to do. And if the children also need to be taught to have a voice as well.
Yes.
It's much bigger than people realize.
Yeah. And like the film exposed was that courts want to determine which is the better parent, which to the child, the child loses, period.
Relevant.
Doesn't matter which one you choose, the child is going to lose. In all cases, every single circumstance that happens in, the child loses. So the courts are not in the best interest of the child if that's what they're doing. So they need to stop and realize that you say that you want the best interest of the child, but choosing the better parent is depriving the child of the love of that parent and their entire family. So, and
it's
then
like, the old argument about intelligence, using IQ tests, and then that stands up as you have this score, therefore you're this intelligent. But really, we're talking about kind of the same thing here, where you've got 2 parents, and who's to say who's the best parent? They may be good at different things. And, grandparents, same deal, right? Like you might have one set of grandparents and they're huge fun, but the other set of grandparents are really good cooks or something, right?
They learn something from them.
And you would never say to that child, which set of grandparents is the better ones? Because you would know that would mess up your child. So why would you do that with their parents?
Yeah.
And we know that men and women, they bring in different skills.
Yeah.
And there is research saying, and I speak about this all the time, that women much better at saying, this is the child's scores at school, this is the child's best friend, this is the child's favorite color, whereas men are like, I have taught the child how to ride the bike or do the swimming, or they bring in all these other different skills. So I can sit with them and I know all these other things about them that aren't necessarily those things. They're all fit. They're all important, because I grew up with my grandfather, so he taught me carpentry skills and mechanics and just how to get around the workshop, and made me a much more rounded female. I can do all those things, and how to start the lawnmower and mow the lawn and play cricket and all that stuff. It's
we
male,
tend to
female,
be tomboys.
we can change the skill sets around, but they come from different genders and they're all important.
And how do you develop a view that is healthy about the opposite sex if you've never had any role models that were positive?
Exactly.
Or
how to deal with conflict. Yeah.
So, you know, and we know that, especially cross-sex, right? Like, you know, sons without mothers, there's a lot of problems there, and what they think then about women. And boys without moms who they've never seen, strong female decision makers who are also loving and caring and so on, right? So there's just so many single parents, so to speak. And I know, like, when I got divorced the first time, I always resented people calling me a single parent, because I said, no, I'm divorced, but I'm not a single parent. So my kids are with me half time. And so if we can get away, I think, too, from using those terms that have never worked, and all they do is they solidified those biases, which are always bad for kids.
Well, and I use those
groundbreaking.
Yeah.
You're groundbreaking.
I use those terms because I didn't know better at the time. You know, I had no idea any of this was going on back then. It wasn't until, you know, just 2 years ago that I started figuring this out. So it's just the normal term that I think people just toss out there and don't really think about what it really means. Now that you know what that kind of means, it's like, oh my gosh, that's, you know, don't use that word, or don't phrase it that way unless they really don't have that.
Unless they really are, and the other person has chosen not to be in their lives at all, and then you are a real single parent. If you're a shared parent, that's a new term we need to start using, and you're dead right. Yeah.
And you know, there's a really good study about death of a parent. So parents that are actually single parents because the other parent died, the kids don't suffer at all emotionally the way that alienated kids
had closure.
Do. Yes. So exactly, they had closure. They still have love. Their parent still shows love for the other party, which really, when you think of it, even
conflict.
Like, I don't particularly like my ex-husband, the first one. You know, he's not my friend as such, but I love him in that he's the dad of my kids, and that's why my kids are so awesome. And, you know, hopefully we all get to think that way, right? And so I still respect him, and he's an important person in my life. And so if people could get away from thinking the marriage was a disaster, that idea, the marriage wasn't a disaster because you produced these amazing kids, like including you two. Yeah. You know, so you're the product of dysfunctional parents. Oh, well. But the part that did function well was, look, you showed up.
Right.
That's a pretty great thing.
Yeah, that's something I had to work through as well, as far as like with my children, because I was considering my marriage as like, oh my gosh, I wish I didn't get involved. I didn't know how to make great decisions on who I should or shouldn't date. I didn't know how to deal with the conflict.
It's a problem.
I didn't know how to do all this stuff. And my kids were the ones that actually taught me. They said, Mom, if you didn't marry him, then we wouldn't be here. And we wouldn't be who we are. And so for that, I had to learn how to appreciate the fact that he is the father of my children, that's all that really matters. Beyond that, it doesn't matter. The fact is that, you know, that is who helped create them. And I love them, every bit of them. So that really does matter.
Yeah, that's excellent. Yeah, to be able to understand that, even if it takes a long time, because you're not really sure where you fit in the big picture, right? Does that mean that I have to think both my parents were just as good as each other? No, you don't have to value them at all, other than they were your parents. Right. You know, and in your kids' case, yeah, you've got great kids out of it. So it's nobody's fault, and it's nobody's credit, really. It's both of you together worked in creating that person.
Yeah, yeah. And I wouldn't trade him for the world.
Yeah, yes. Exactly.
I think the study that you're referring to, I am aware of that one, and I think from my experience as a therapist and having seen children who's had a parent who has died, a lot of the time the remaining parent is wonderful about including the parent who's died's family. So all of them are still in the lives of these children. They're still all talking about the parent that's passed. They're still all speaking these amazing stories, so the children still have access to the family of the parent that's passed, and they're spoken about in a wonderful manner, and you know, almost saintly in some cases, which sort of is kind of like, okay, but whatever, that's fine. But the children have these wonderful memories and stories still coming in, and the richness of having that side of the family.
That parents don't matter. Yeah.
PA kids don't get that. It's
No.
They are the worst. They're cut off. You don't get to know them. You don't get to know anything about them. They will all pass, die. You'll never ever get that part of you.
I spoke about that in my Guardians and Gatekeepers speech about the living grievance that I went through. I wrote it in one of my books too, that I didn't get a chance to grieve the loss of my dad, but I still lost him. So I grew up grieving for him. And then when I found him, we got to close some of those wounds and heal together. And you can't heal without that person. That is one thing I can 100% say. If you want to heal, you have to reconnect with that person, because there's where the answers lie. And then when I lost him again, it was grieving the same person a second time in one lifetime. And
Yeah,
that's really awful. Detrimental for a child to have to face and go through, like, you know, and the guilt that comes with some of the things that, you know, things that you remember that you thought about them, and then you find out that wasn't true. So you're working through all these things, and you're so glad and elated that you have them back, only to be taken from you again. And that just adds to anger, the anger cycle and stuff that you're going through when you're working through this stuff, because it's definitely part of that process.
I would think from your dad's perspective that even though he passed away a couple of years later, he was literally at peace, right?
Yeah.
And he would not have been otherwise. So even though it was doubly hard for you, you can rest assured you did the best you could by him.
Mm-hmm.
You know, right?
Yeah, he got his daughter back, and then, you know, I also was able to reunite him with his mom's side of the family that he had lost track. She died when he was 14, so he had lost
again,
her.
Abandonment again. Jean, yeah, here we are.
And then he never met his dad. His dad never even knew about him. So, you know, he didn't have a father growing up either. Then he has his mom die, and then he loses his daughter. I mean, he was like, done. I'm not having kids. I'm not doing anything anymore. And it took my stepmom now, it took her 12 years to talk him into having a family, because he didn't want to be hurt again. He was like, no, I can't do that again. So he had to go through that process as well as coming at it through the parent side of it. And then when I came back in and I started doing, I wanted to know who my grandparents were, because he's like, you know, I don't know who my dad is. I don't know if I have any family on that side. And my mom died, and I lost contact with my cousins. So I started doing the ancestry DNA, and that's when they started contacting me. And they were like, who are you? So when I told them, they were like, oh my gosh, they were elated that they finally found him, and he got to talk to them before he died. So that was
so great.
That was really cool that, you know, at least he got to come back. Now, he didn't get to meet anybody on his father's side. I've met them since, but he got to reconnect with the family he knew, at least, before he passed.
Which is huge. Mm-hmm. You know, that I can't imagine, but that would be so much better than, you know, you're already, you know, you're going to die. Yeah. But you just have all these questions left unanswered. You even wonder, you know, did my kids ever think about me? I can't imagine how awful that would be.
Yeah.
Yes, but how can more anthropologists help, do you think? I'm very interested in that.
On the whole discipline really is it's such a broad discipline, right? It's a little bit of everything, but really the definition of anthropology is the study of humans. So, you know, whether we're talking about evolution or we're looking at archaeology or different cultures or whatever, is sort of just knowing ourselves as humans better in the universe. So another part of the work I do is looking cross-culturally. You know, how do other parents manage their kids? And, you know, there are still cultures where dad owns the children. And there are cultures where, you know, mom has final say in everything. Yep. But there are also cultures where they still are very egalitarian. And in those cultures, that's where we see the really healthy kids. You know, like those are the kids where it does take a village to raise a child. And these are kids who have love everywhere. So they have the same kinds of upsets that normal kids have that, you know, come from decent childhoods. And they go through adolescent turmoil and so on as well. But I think the difference, though, is in egalitarian societies, the child always knows that at least one parent is always around. And it's not a specific one, it's either one. You know, like, is dad around today? Oh, no. Okay, well, then I'll go check out where mom is, even if she lives in a different hut or something, right? But it's not always people living in the middle of nowhere. There's you know, urban societies that are quite egalitarian too. And so kids actually are valuing their parents equally, even though the parents might be incredibly different and do very different jobs, or not. But the kids really don't care. It's just kind of like, you know what, we've got one of my parents is always around somewhere. I don't know who it's going to be today or this hour. And really, that's how it should be, because it's not the child's job to figure out who's supposed to be seeing me now and where I'm supposed to go. That's the parent's job to say, here's what you're doing today, and support that child in making sure that gets done. That's how you teach your children responsibility and independence.
Yeah.
That's all about secure attachment too, isn't it? Like you've always got someone that you can securely attach to, and that's beautiful, because for a lot of us, we didn't have that. We didn't have that second person to go to, and the attachment was weird. Like, anyway.
And it's not even just the enmeshment piece. You know, it's if one parent is afraid to let you become the least bit independent, they're also not going to be handing you off as a baby at a baby shower. You know, they don't even do that stuff, right? They're too afraid to let you go for a second. So right from the beginning, you're not learning those skills that you normally would develop along the way. And then you're also losing another parent over time, you know? So you've got this imbalance of power, but both are kind of equally damaging to you, right? Because you should be able to go to your friend's house for supper or have a sleepover, and nobody is rivaling anybody else, and you already know that that's a safe place to go because your parents have already checked it out.
Yeah,
like, that's
wonderful.
The parent's job. It's not the child's job.
Boy, there's big lessons there. There's big messages there. I love that. So how are we going for time?
Good, but I wanted to mention something really quick about, you know, the studies that you've done with anthropology. One of the things that I heard you say on one of your lectures was that parents should be both parents are the norm, and children come into this world with two parents. We have two parents. When we come in, that is what is normal for us as well. So I appreciate that comment. And you also say it's unnatural for one parent to be more important than the other. And can you talk about that, and about in your studies and relating that to parental alienation?
Yeah, the imbalance of power is really important, right? That the power dynamic should not even be apparent to a child. You know, if it's a healthy family, as a child, I never thought of that. I never thought of who's the boss.
Yeah,
I know my parents had especially then, they had a particular dynamic, but to me, they were a unified front. So I could never go to one parent and say, well, what do you think? Mom says no, will you let me? Right? Because my parents made sure that they said, well, we'll talk about it together and we'll tell you. And divorced couples do that very well too. You know, they'll say, well, have you talked to mom about it? Oh yeah, she said yes. Oh, okay, well, let me just call her up and make sure. You know, those kinds of things, right? So you can still diffuse the power differential, because kids are smart and they're going to use it if they can.
Gotcha.
But another part that I've had questions about was, transgender people and same-sex marriage. Mm-hmm. And, so what about in those cases? Because then kids are born to, yes, the product of a sperm and an ovum, but, they're a same-sex couple. So does that mean then that one parent isn't important because maybe they didn't carry that child and the other parent was just the sperm donor or whatever?
That's the case. Only one can be a biological parent, and the other one, so Yeah.
But, you know, you still, as a child, in my book, you still have a right to know both your bio parents too.
Exactly.
And I know,
considers them both
some same-sex couples that are doing a great job of this, where the dad, like in one case, it's two women, so the child has two moms, but the child also knows the person who was bio dad, and bio dad is still around, and the child calls that person uncle. Hardly ever sees him, but knows where he is and can contact him if needed. But from the beginning, that child has known, we're your moms and we're raising you. But you know, if you need to know anything about your history or whatever, then you know how to reach uncle, whatever. Right? So he's never taken out of the picture. And the children are very healthy. They're totally fine with that. And so for me, especially like being an older person, hearing that, I'm thinking, this is so weird. Like the world has just changed so much. Like weird in that we never dealt with that stuff, right?
No.
But this is still a healthy scenario, whatever it looks like. And the child still has an extra party who loves him or her.
Added love.
And it's just like step parents too, right? It's just extra love. So like my children who now are 30-ish, you know, they're both saying that their stepmom, my ex-husband's wife, they love her, you know, and they'll say they talk about her and, you know, they were over there for supper and here's what she made and all this stuff. And she talks about them as if they're her kids, but she also has her own kids too, because she was divorced. And I love that because I think my kids have 4 adults who love them as parents. So they're very lucky that way.
Well, and I think any situation when, and hopefully judges will hear this, lawyers will hear this, when you're looking at a situation, go with the path that adds more love.
Good point. Yeah, that's an easy way to say it.
Yep. If you add the love, that's the way that they need to go. Because if you're taking away the love, then you're adding to the damage of the child. And these damages are long-term.
Yeah.
It lasts the rest of our lives. And
well said. Yeah, and I like what you said too about the same-sex marriages now in Australia. Woohoo! And the parents as well, and the children, and often a lot of my friends who have same-sex marriages, the person who's contributed to the child is still around, and they're visiting and hanging out, and it's not about who's a threat. It's about the child and what's the best for them growing up. And also the other thing is what's potentially physically going to be a factor. If there is heart disease in that person's life, or diabetes or anything like that, how's that going to impact on the child's health when they're older, or is there any mental health stuff going on? And it's about really now understanding the child and giving them an opportunity to see what they could be exposed to genetically as well. So it's giving them all of that, as instead of they don't get that piece to the puzzle at all. So yeah,
and as Dawn said, if it's an addition of love, how can that be wrong? And kids do figure it out. So I've heard some people say that would be very confusing for the children. They wouldn't know who their real parents were. Kids are so smart; they know exactly. They'll say, "Well, that's my bio mom or bio dad or whatever," and then I also have a stepmom and I have this stepdad. And you know, it's often it seems confusing to the rest of us. To them, it makes perfect sense.
Yep.
And again, I would say, like as a cultural anthropologist now, looking at other cultures where kinship is a huge deal. Here we don't make much of it, right? Like nobody really knows who their cousins once removed were, and you know, you often don't live near your extended family and so on. But in many cultures they do. And they know everybody's name and how they're related to everybody else and in what generation. And all it does is make them feel more secure. So
I am living proof of that, because I know who my second and third and eighth cousins are. And I don't care what number there is, they're my cousins. And I have my own family now. And there's one other thing I want to talk about. You were talking about how the two moms and how the bio dad was still there, and that the child could always access them if they needed one of the things that I think, and there's probably people out there that won't agree with me, but I have been adopted, and it wasn't an adoption that was done accurately because my biological father did not give permission, nor did they even try to find him. So
Yeah.
I truly believe that every child has the right to know who their biological parents are.
Absolutely.
Unless that parent just absolutely refuses to ever have contact, the child deserves to know that. But that's, and I can see where that could be a very painful thing, but I still think that children have the right to know who their biological families are.
Yeah, absolutely. And the adoption piece is an interesting one because oftentimes it is when the child does find out who the missing bio parent is, it'll be spun to them that the parent didn't want any part of them, who gave up their rights to that child. When in fact, what happened was, for instance, the bio parent couldn't pay child support. Because child support's a huge amount of money. And if you tack on spousal to that too, it's even more encumbering, right? So when parent can't pay child support, then step parent maybe steps in and says, well, you know what, I'll take this child off your hands, and you will never have to worry about child support again. And a deal is struck, and then that child grows up and thinks that the parent gave them up and didn't love them. Mm-hmm. When in fact, that's never what happened. And they may not find that out for the rest of their lives or well into adulthood. And, I think for them, it's super helpful when they do find out that the deal was struck. Yeah. Even if that means hopefully temporarily, but maybe they're not going to like that step parent for doing it, or the alienator.
Yeah.
But maybe they need to find that out because they really needed to know that they were not rejected by one of their bio parents.
Exactly. That's exactly how I felt. I felt like, oh my gosh, thank God that he did want me, because I grew up thinking he didn't want me.
Yeah.
So finding that out is very important, and to know, even if it is a deal, even if it was because there was hardship, or maybe the mom was young, or maybe the dad wasn't around, or there's all kinds of reasons why an adoption may take place. It's not always, just I didn't want you scenario. I mean, like you said, that's probably rarely the case. So having that information is going to help the child eventually understand what happened and who they are, because we still want to know who we are and where we came from.
Yeah, exactly. Because if we can just shine a light for a second on Alyse Lauren, she's one of our people that we interviewed who's an adult child of very serious child sexual abuse, but she was given up by her mother, sold for a price, we believe this was illegal, to a man and a woman who were married, and given to them, sold to them in America, and basically doesn't know where her mother is, has no idea about the father. So, and she was sold to a man who used her for sex for years after that, from when she was a tiny little girl. So, so now she's left as an adult, and she's very close to Dawn and I. She's now left as an adult, trying to put the pieces of her life together from
she needs to know
that beginning. And she doesn't know. We know the name of her mother, but we don't know where she is. We don't know any of the background. We don't know whether the adoption was legal either. So these people adopted her.
Or did they take her from the mom and then she ended up being adopted? What was the circumstances? Because that could provide an awful lot of healing for her, because she had a very tragic childhood.
Yeah. And chances are the mother didn't want to give her up, right? And maybe circumstances made her give her up. We don't know.
She's very young.
It sure would be helpful to find out. And the rest of it is almost a separate incident, right? Because you have criminal behavior, and then you have what happened to her as a result of her mother giving her up. And, there's so many parts to that, hey, to try to dig into.
Yeah. And Alyse's interview is part of our video series. So if anybody is being triggered by this story, please go and talk to somebody. I'm sorry, we didn't put a trigger warning in there. I'm sorry about that. But if you're interested, go and listen to Alyse's interview as well, because we've actually named her mother on there, and we're looking for her mother to see if she's alive as well, to see if we can find any story for Alyse. Her name's Alyse with a C, just to put some pieces together. But this is adoption. This is serious. It's very, very serious consequences for the children.
Yep.
So,
And you're not alone.
No.
and you're
And
not
I
alone.
think adoption, the way it's done, I would love to see that completely redone. I think that for my circumstances where an affidavit was filled out that had inaccurate information and they just took it for face value and erased my parent, just like that with a piece of paper, that should not be allowed. And for children,
No, it should not be allowed.
no,
I cannot believe from an Australian point of view that's happening. Like, you can't do that here. You can't do that here.
Well, they have their own mandate.
Understand.
The state had their own mandate that they were required by the law that they needed to spend 60 days in investigating and searching for that other parent. But because the affidavit was signed and she had a replacement father, I call it, he's basically a replacement, standing there saying, I'm willing to step up, they just said, okay, we'll waive it. And they just waived the investigation, even though that was the law. And had they looked for my dad, I would have been reunited with him when I was 8.
And these days, really, when they say they can't find someone, really, because I'm pretty sure you
really,
can find
I know.
Yeah, so how hard did they?
I found him.
So if they can't find someone, that's even more reason not to let the adoption go through, because they haven't gained a yes.
Yeah.
I don't think I'm not against adoption, and I'm not against step parents, because I know that when parents divorce, they tend to remarry and get into new relationships, and children should have more love, and that I'm okay with. It's when that situation starts breaking down the bond between the other biological parent that I disagree with adoption, and I disagree with the state coming in and saying, okay, well, we sanction this, you are now adopted. I just don't find the value, and I think it's very detrimental to the child.
I think people who are making those rules have not been exposed to adoption.
Nope. And they haven't heard us.
Oh my gosh.
And really, a healthy step parent does not want to replace a bio parent.
Right.
No.
And we have lots of...
Maybe you should have to take a step parenting course. When I got married the second time, we actually did take a step parenting course because we both thought this might be a good idea because we both have kids. And it was a good course, but unfortunately it didn't help with the ex being an alienator. But they could mandate that stuff, right? So whenever the cost is talked about, it makes me almost laugh, because I think really the cost is what's preventing these prevention programs, because the cost to society is massive when you look at youth crime, but also mental health later in life, even depression and anxiety. Like, we have a generation of anxious kids now who are adults, and they all think that there's something inherently flawed with them because they're anxious. Right. And yet when you start talking to them, so many of them were alienated. What kind of costs did that impose that could have been completely avoided?
Oh,
the
absolutely.
cost is ridiculous. It's the figure being thrown around is a $50 billion industry in high conflict divorce in America. If we put money into prevention, how's that going to affect that industry is the question.
Well,
why are they fighting so hard against it? I mean, really, what's the cost of a parenting program?
Well, what dollar amount do you put on a child going through depression and anxiety like I have, like Alyse probably has, like other children like us have? What dollar amount do you put on that? And then have they figured out how much, when you put $3 into the child support system and the other parent only gets 2/4 out of that, where's that money going?
Yeah, exactly.
So I have a hard time believing that there's a problem with being able to afford it.
Do you have any comments?
Well,
Sorry.
sort of just quickly coming back to the family law system too, you know, it does make you wonder, where's the incentive to resolve this?
Yeah.
Because
Yeah,
it's a very, very lucrative industry.
Yeah.
Yes, again, where's the children's rights in this?
Yeah.
Mhm.
And yeah, but do we have any comments or questions or anything, Dawn?
We only have a few. Dorsey popped in. She said that you are amazing. In your book
Aw.
should be a read by everyone working in the family court system.
Yes,
Thanks,
we agree.
Yep. And
Thank you,
a couple people have had some realization. Danielle, who says that she was kept away from her parent. She's actually kept away from her dad, even as an adult, because of her stepmom won't allow his children to visit him. And then Dorsey also says, so true, the entire society globally is dysfunctional because of this transgenerational trauma. So that's back to our
Yes, thank you,
earlier
Dorsey. Yep, good. Thanks for the validation.
Yep, and then Danica says effectively shared parenting can bring ease, and then the culture is to weaponize at the beginning, creating a winner takes all environment, which
Thanks, Danica. Yeah, huge. Good comments. Really, really, really powerful.
yeah.
And it's really great to have everybody listening and commenting and getting on the same page. It's really important.
Yeah, we just have to start getting this into our court systems, our schools, in the colleges and
Frontline, yes, the community workers, the nurses, the doctors, the police.
Yep.
Like the police are seeing PA out there going on, like, I work with a lot of the police. I think
it would also help them.
I talk to them about it. Yeah, they are very aware. And because the other thing is really interesting, a lot of the police who come to see me for crisis counselling and things, it's a lot about PTSD and their marriages. A lot of them, unfortunately, have marriages that don't work because of the effects of that they're being, and all the things they're being exposed to and how it's impacting. So their mental health isn't really being looked after properly, but then they're exposed to PA. And pretty much most of the cops who come in to talk to me are targeted parents.
And I think another thing that would help police officers as well is that the judges should be inclined to follow their own court order. If they issued an order, then they should be enforcing it. So when a police officer goes out there and there is a custody agreement, that if they have to make an arrest because somebody withheld or did something, that they're not wasting their time filling out all that paperwork just for that person to walk the next day. I mean, it's really a messed up system where
what's going on there?
The police officers are like, why bother? My hands are tied. I can't do anything.
Well, that and a lot of the alienators are involved in the system too. They also often work in human services, or they are.
That's true. That's true. We see them.
Or legal system, and they know exactly how to work it.
Yes.
And they know that court orders are ignored. And if a court order is ignored, then you've got to go back and file an enforcement order. That's going to cost you more money. You're already living, hand to mouth because you've basically been trying to hang on to one job while you're working the other job, which is trying to get through the legal system. So yeah, it's just a nightmare that never ends, and it's really aided and abetted by the legal system at this point. And even the couple of lawyers that I know are really good people and are helping to work towards resolving this this issue, they also agree that family law is broken, and that at its very worst, you could say corrupt. It's of such a financial benefit that when you're paying with kids' lives, in billable hours, how does that possibly even happen?
Yeah, I would like to know the answer to that question.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, absolutely. So that's what I was trying to accomplish, being part of the NPO chair. I'm the chair for Florida. And we've gone up to Tallahassee, which is our capital, to talk to some of our leaders, and was able to talk to 3 of them, and they get it. They understand it, but there's that opposing party that always steps in, and they're looking at it from that monetary position, and they're not thinking about the children. Yeah. Exactly.
Okay, so do we want to sort of wind it up? And is there anything that either of you would like to add at this point?
I think I'm good. I
Yeah, I
think this
think
has
I am
been
too. I can't think
full
of
of
anything
information.
else.
Yeah.
Mhm.
Yeah. All right. Well, we'll wrap it up. Don't go anywhere yet, though. I'll just go ahead and close it out with everybody on Facebook. So everybody, thank you so much for joining us and for participating. If you have questions, keep posting them in the comments because we do keep checking back. And also come join us next week when we also interview Dr. Bill Burnett. So that should be another amazing interview. So please join us for that. So we will see you then. Bye for now.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.